Hey y'all, my name is Rob McLain. I'm a professor of history at Cal State Fullerton, and Ms. Hegwood has asked me to answer some questions about World War II y'all have. First regarding the Doolittle raid and then regarding the Battle of the Bulge. So I'm going to try to do this kind of quickly together so the video file's not too large and to save some time. And so thank you, Ms. Hegwood, my big sister. So let me begin with Doolittle. And one of the questions I had was when Japanese imperialism began. Now, you can really kind of point to the late 19th century, the late 1800s, when Japan became interested in acquiring resources in China and in mainland East Asia. Now, it's worth keeping in mind that there are a number of imperial powers already operating in China: Britain, France, Portugal, the United States. All of these countries had trading rights in China, and China at that time was in a very weak state. So it was easy for imperial powers to kind of move in and assert their authority. And Japan saw themselves as just kind of playing the imperial game alongside everyone else. Now, what did happen with Japan was that they had modernized very quickly. Beginning in the 1860s, Japan had been closed off from much of the world for most of its history. And then in around 1854, an American admiral sailed a fleet of ships into Tokyo Harbor and demanded that Japan open trade to the West, which the Japanese had no choice in doing. They also decided, as a result of the American visit, that they would try to emulate the success of the European powers and the United States in modernizing their economy. So between 1867 and 1910, Japan began a program of modernization that also culminated with a program of imperialism. So, for example, they went to war with China in the 1890s the first time in the modern era. They annexed Korea in 1910 and really wanted the resources of East Asia. Now, this would inevitably put them on a collision course with the other imperial powers in the region, especially Great Britain and the United States, which had taken over the Philippines and as a result of the Spanish-American War in the 1890s. Now, Japan needed oil, and they needed rice, and they needed rubber for their industries and their growing population. So they really needed an empire, one way or another, in Southeast Asia. And to get that empire, eventually they would run up against the British, who controlled Singapore, and the Americans, who controlled the Philippines. Now, by the 1930s, the Americans had become very wary of Japanese intentions in East Asia, and the relationship steadily deteriorated until in 1941, the Japanese decided that they would attack the United States because they felt like they could only meet their goals of acquiring oil and resources if they defeated the United States fleet, which meant capturing the Philippines and destroying the American fleet at Pearl Harbor. Now, after the Japanese attack on December 7th, 1941, about 6 months after that, President Roosevelt wanted something to boost public morale because the United States we were losing very badly at that point in the war. And a naval officer by the name of Francis Lowe had noted that a smaller two-engine bomber, the B-25, could take off on a very short runway. And he shared that information with the head of the American Navy, Chester Nimitz. They theorized that a plane like that, the B-25, could take off of an aircraft carrier. So in a relatively secret, a top secret plan, really, very few people know what the plan was. An American aeronautical engineer and officer, Air Force officer, Army Air Corps officer, the Air Force doesn't exist yet, by the name of Jimmy Doolittle, asked for volunteers for a very dangerous mission. Now, they didn't know what they were volunteering for, but everybody was on board. So, for quite a while, even the pilots didn't know what they were volunteering to do, and that was to fly 16 twin-engine bombers off the decks of an aircraft carrier and bomb Japan. So it's a very risky plan. They initially had hoped to take off about 370 miles from Japan and then fly through to friendly areas of China where the Chinese would help them escape. Now, unfortunately, a Japanese fishing vessel saw them, and they had to launch early, way earlier than they planned. So they launched probably closer to 600 miles offshore instead of, 350 to 400. Now, so this meant that their fuel supply would not last very long, and there was a good possibility they would have to crash land somewhere. All of the planes crash landed except for one that landed in far eastern Russia. Now, they planned to bomb military facilities in a number of different cities, but Tokyo was the main target, and the bombing rate itself had very little military significance. It had very little military significance, but it boosted American morale. The American response to the raid was ecstatic, and especially since at this time the last American and Filipino soldiers fighting on the island of Bataan in the Philippines were literally just about to surrender. They were starving. So for the Americans, it was a huge boost. For the Japanese, especially the Japanese Navy, it was a great loss of face, an embarrassment. They knew the attack was coming, and they assumed that they would be able to intercept it in time, but they lost track of the American carriers. Admiral Yamamoto, the head of the Japanese Navy, became even more determined to draw the American Navy into a decisive battle and destroy its aircraft carriers. He, let's see, what is one of the questions? I'm making sure I'm addressing everything. Yamamoto decided at that point that he had to destroy the American Navy. So it had very little military impact, but it had huge psychological impact. Just 3 months after the Doolittle raid, the Americans and the Japanese would meet at the Battle of Midway, deep in the Pacific Ocean, and the Japanese would lose 4 of their heavy carriers. It was one of the most decisive battles in the Pacific, and it was a direct result of the Doolittle raid. Now, one of the other tragic results of this was because the American bombers all crash landed in China, and many of the American flyers were escaped with the help of Chinese guerrilla fighters, anti-Japanese guerrilla fighters. The Japanese launched a massive offensive in eastern China that killed probably 250,000 people. So that's part of the tragedy. You really don't hear about it. But it had a profound psychological effect, both in boosting American morale and convincing Admiral Yamamoto, who never wanted to go to war with the United States in the first place. He had been educated at Harvard, by the way. He knew American war potential was great. It convinced Yamamoto that he had to destroy the American fleet, and it led him to be somewhat reckless at the Battle of Midway, where 4 carriers were sunk. It was a tremendous loss for Japan, in that it takes a long time to build aircraft carriers, and many of their best pilots were killed at Midway. So actually, I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to do a separate video for the Battle of the Bulge. Thank you.